It's time to be woke, take off your shades, it helps see through the smoke, cause the wicked hide behind the cloak, and if you stay in the mist, you gon' be soaked, so listen up, cause this hair of the dog, what's real, what ain't, is this the fog or smog, cause there's a difference when you breathe it in, so don't let the corporate media take you for a spin, this that morning show, they put you in the know, so I hope that you ready, cause all we do is go, 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 yeah, come get your info, you gon' be like, whoa. Dog, we bout that, ayy. We in the zone, we out here, yeah. Speeding the fact.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hair of the Dog. I'm Andy Kennedy, and it is Monday morning. A great day to be alive in what is now an extension of 2020, well, at least here in this country. We have a great show with just jam-packed with great stuff, facts, and we're going to walk through quite a bit of it together, and that starts with the introduction of my lovely and talented co-host, Ms. Carrie Barber. Good morning, Carrie.
Hey, good morning, Andy. Really appreciate that introduction. So welcome to all our new viewers. We are so thrilled to have such a growing audience, and for me personally, I appreciate it because what we try to do here is a little bit different than what you may have seen in other independent media sources. We try to be unbiased and objective. And that means presenting factual information, giving you examples. It's not a right or left thing. It is purely progressive. And that means we fact check everything. So some of the information that we're going to cover today, depending on which side of the aisle you find yourself, you might be a little upset about it, but I just hold on, come with us through all of this. Because a lot of what you're going to hear today, you may be hearing for the first time. So yeah, with that, one of the big events that happened this weekend was May Day. So this was May 1st. And from a worker organizing standpoint, this is kind of a big deal. This is Labor Day. But it's unions. It's all about unions and workers' rights and all of the things that went on this weekend. I personally was just so thrilled to see it because these activities for workers' rights were happening in every state, just about every city, all around the world. It was an international movement. And here in this country, in the United States, it followed a week of all the unions pushing something called the PRO Act. The PRO Act is a piece of legislation that is in Congress right now. And unions prepared a 16-page document that they handed to Congress, particularly to the senators. And at the forefront of all of this was this statement, and I want to read it to you now. I'll also include a link to it so that you can read it for yourself. But they said why the PRO Act matters for the right to unionize in the United States. And they said the PRO Act would bring the US closer to meeting its obligations under international law by eliminating many of the barriers that prevent workers from exercising their rights to organize a union. Protecting these rights is critical to reducing economic inequality as it allows workers to bargain collectively for fair wages, adequate benefits, safe working conditions, reducing power imbalances between workers and employers. So just put that statement right there. Were you aware that the United States was already in violation of international agreements because we have such an imbalance? We saw this with union workers trying to organize in Alabama against Amazon. And then we talked about it on Friday where Elon Musk was just
everybody's favorite capitalist.
Right. Elon Musk and Tesla were just busted by the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, for union busting. So this is happening everywhere in this country, even though it's a constitutional protected right under the 14th Amendment. So that's why the May Day celebrations here, I think, were so heartwarming for those of us who recognize its constitutional violation, and union membership and the right to organize is the fastest track to eliminating income inequality and building up workers' rights, their pay equity, all of these things. So one thing I do want to mention is I saw this meme and it was so telling. It was talking about business owners who are really upset about the unemployment benefits and how they can't get people to go to work because they'd rather take the unemployment. And it broke it down by the numbers. And it said basically it's $1,500 for your unemployment, which equates to $7.50. If you as a business owner are losing employees and your workforce to unemployment, then you really need to take a hard look at your business model and maybe make adjustments because $7.50.
Yeah. And I think the narrative was, hey, government, you're giving away our secret. Right?
Yeah.
We've seen a decline in union membership, well, basically since the 70s, right? With the capital taking more of the share of GDP, of the national wealth, and stagnating wages and losing benefits, and that becoming the norm because, oh, well, that's just the way it is, right? It should be that my pay hasn't gone up in 2 decades, while the CEOs are now making 7-8-figure salaries. That's totally normal. And that's the way it should be because they work so hard.
They don't. You can replace most CEOs with a 9-year-old and be just fine. That's the reality of it. And
certainly that's the way they behave.
Exactly. And you brought up some really great points. And then on the backdrop of this wage inequity, you have the productivity of the American worker just off the charts. So all of that has gone up while our wages have stagnated. And that is why union membership is so important. So because corporate media did not cover the events around the country, and I want to thank Mike Pitino in particular for sending some video out, particularly from Chicago, and sharing some other resources. But these events were happening all over the country and all over the world. And we have just a few examples that we wanted to share with you this morning. So take a look.
I'm here as a president and a Teamster member to speak to you all. And this is about workers. This is about dignity. This is about respect. This is about raising our voices. How do we do that? Mobilize, organize, and agitate. That's how you win worker justice in our community.
Gee, Carrie, how come I didn't see any of these gatherings in mainstream media?
Well, Andy, I'm so glad you asked because that is the subject of our big series. And this is something that we're going to talk about quite a lot as we go forward. But let's really get into corporate media bias. And I know that people are rolling their eyes going, well, you sound like a Republican, you sound like Fox News. But wait, there's some things.
Wait, there's more.
Right. There's some things we really need to have a tough conversation about the state of news media, particularly in this country. And I keep seeing over and over again where people call back to the Fairness Doctrine. And you're right, when the Fairness Doctrine was ended, and this was a piece of legislation by the FCC, they mandated that news broadcasts had to have a fair and balanced approach. So you had to go in and just do the who, what, where, when, why. and talk about, well, this side says this side says that, and present both arguments to it and hope that the viewer found, some critical thinking skills to make a decision on their own. I get that. Most people point back to that because that was under Reagan that was ended, particularly on the left. They point to that. There's other pieces of legislation that happened in collaboration with the neocons and the neoliberals, those third way Dems who are now in charge of the Democratic Party and sit in the White House. So we need to talk about some of that because all of these things go into the state of media and pertain to why you're not seeing May Day celebrations and the big union push other than a single line item in the State of the Union address. So Andy, this is the first graphic. If you would be so kind, let's pull this one up. I think that particularly after the June 6th insurrection, we had a very nice push about educating the public on media bias. And in some circles, this has been an ongoing conversation. There's a piece that's missing in this media bias, right? So I went out to All Sides, the media bias chart. This is a website that helps people understand where their news is coming from and what the bias is. So they do this really nice effort of doing far left, middle, left, center, right, and then far right. So that's helpful for most people. Here's the problem with that. Most of these companies on the left and the right are owned by the same corporation. So what is actually happening is these are different brands that they are using to cultivate a narrative and the top of mind thought process in the public. This is legalized, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. It's a legal way of manipulating the public into a acceptance of certain policy. I don't want to outright call it brainwashing because this requires the user to be complicit to their own manipulation.
Right, and we've also heard the narrative a number of occasions, especially on the right, that they don't consider their shows to be actual news programs. They are entertainment programs, right? And if you label something that way, then you can basically say what you want, which, just sounds like exactly what your audience wants to hear. And I think the difference between the left and the right is that the right is willing to admit it and the left isn't.
That's exactly right. And what Andy's referring to, for those who are not aware, is when Fox News has been brought into court, into legal battles, to defend their false reporting, their argument has consistently been, we're just entertainment. We're just entertainment. But I think it goes a little bit further than that because from a marketing standpoint, you have MSNBC with Rachel Maddow, and then you have Tucker Carlson on Fox News. And the two of them are two sides to the same coin, not necessarily in their opinions and reporting, but from a marketing standpoint, they rely on each other to promote their viewership. And all of this goes into the, if it bleeds, it leads. It is a fear-based model to get you to continue watching that broadcast. So both sides of these two are using each other. And yet, when we take a closer look at who owns these networks and how things are really working behind the scenes, there's a reason for it, right? It'd be like if Skippy Peanut Butter and Jif Peanut Butter had a social media war, and then you found out one single company owns both brands.
And they're all just nuts.
Nicely done, Andy.
Thank you. Well, I was going to say, I think that you can see this with Fox News in the entertainment industry because to me, they're like the perfect combination of Breaking Bad, the Sons of Anarchy, and the Golden Girls.
That's exactly, yeah, very good analogy. I'm sure they would appreciate that. But in this particular graphic, I went ahead and put like a red highlight, a box around all of these media outlets that have corporate ownership And I think you're going to be really interested to find out who owns each one of these, because we tend to think that news media on the left is completely separate from news media on the right, and that is not the case. And this goes for not only your corporate news, your video, your cable, but also your newspapers. So it is a zero-sum game when it comes to media here in this country. So yeah. So Andy, let's get to the next graphic as an example of what I'm talking about with media bias. This is something that was very recent and disappointing. So in earlier broadcasts, we talked about Operation Mockingbird. This was a CIA-led program to manipulate the American public into going to war and to, as the anti-communism and all of these sorts of things. So, hindsight's 2020 is like, what was it, like 50 years ago? Maybe we need to do a refresher, at least for me, on Operation Mockingbird. But
yeah, well, there's a lot of people that think that that's never ended.
And you know what? In some respects, they're kind of right, because it works so well, and the psyops of all of this is just so telling. And you'll see this when you have a press release or a story that originates in one of the lettered organizations here in the United States, gets handed off to a reporter, a friendly reporter, and then published as credible news. The biggest example that we saw was this Russiagate thing. And I have to admit that when the story first broke, and I was trying to do my due diligence of vetting, I was in it too, because this one was so well done, because you had State Department officials as whistleblowers, you had CIA, you had, ex British intelligence, you had all the pieces there. But when you started to peel back, it was really hard to find the source documents, or they were holding on to it, and just the information really never came out. And so you had the Steele dossier that was heavily redacted. How can you, as a journalist, piece through a heavily redacted document? You can't. So,
well, and as well, you had the gentleman that was made. His name escapes me at the moment, made head of looking into all of the Russian collusion, who refused to speak to the media, right? So there was nothing coming from that at all. So it lent itself to the narrative being controlled by CNN and MSNBC. We look back at all that time, and the single most popular pundit of that was the person that was most listened to, which is the Rachel Maddow show, right? And so she basically came out in her black pantsuit every single day and said the same narrative over and over and over. Well, you say something enough times and it ends up being true in the echo chamber, which is MSNBC. And like, I mean, people think that this is simply just a thing that happens on the right, but we know it isn't. And it came when I forget, was it 2019 when it all came crashing down?
right.
And but they still didn't change their narrative. They kept it up. They doubled down. Oh, but what about this? What about this? And now we're seeing the same thing over and over again. And it's kind of annoying.
Well, not just annoying, but irresponsible. So I remember years ago, I had to do a public apology, because I was, even before 2019, I was like, wait a second, something's not right. But yet, you're right. To this day, how many times have people who are watching our program now, how many times have you been called a Russian bot? This is a small piece of the cultural shift that happened because of this particular story.
Right.
The other part of it is when we talk about the divide in our country, there's a profit margin there. And this all helped with that particular profit margin,
Right.
to the detriment of my own community, right? So we still see today, how can I unify with such and such on the right? How can I do, not realizing that we are separating ourselves because we've been exposed to these kind of false narratives for years. And as you said, day in, day out, people that we trust, right? So there's a gentleman that I want to bring on, and we're still working out schedule, that talks about the psychology of this, right? And during COVID, as an independent journalist, we were able to level the playing field because the $1 million studios and everything else had to go away. And we saw those people that you trust for whatever reason having to broadcast from their kitchens and their living rooms too. So for those of us without the $1 million behind us from corporate media, we were finally on that level playing ground. But when you have, there's something about the human psyche that if you have money and backing, you are legitimate. We saw this with the rise of Trump. He must be a good businessman because he's got so much money. And you see this also when it comes to corporate media. It must be credible because they've got so much money and backing, and look at their studio and how slick it is and their production value. That's a problem. And
Well, it is.
us.
It's exactly the issue, because, you know, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that if you're just the average Joe in your house and you're seeing these people on television on a weekly or daily basis, there's a familiarity there, right? And even subconsciously, I think that familiarity is almost like a friendship. It's a one-way friendship, obviously, but it's there. And that's what happens with name recognition, and people think that they're electing their friends to office, right? Why did Oprah Winfrey get such a big push? Oh, you've got to run, rich person, right? It's because a lot of the people that were home during the day would tune into her show on a daily basis. So there was a one-way friendship that came with that, right? And that we put these people on a pedestal because they were so successful. Right.
Yeah, and this is part of the progressive movement, is redefining what number one, work is. Number two, what is success? And I have to admit, I have a personal kind of dig here, because I've been doing investigative journalism for a number of years, and I never once did it for the byline. And with the work and the stories that I cover, I also knew that it was a slim chance in hell that I was ever going to get a byline in one of those credible publications, because I cover corruption and political malfeasance and all of these things. And when you have a corporate entity who is still working on getting access, they're never going to publish it. So people need to understand, for a journalist like me, what happens behind the scenes is at a big newspaper or sometimes even a television station, when a journalist believes in a story and knows that there is substance here that people need to know, they reach out to somebody like me to finish the story. So we've all become introduced to the narrative of the concept of catch and kill. This is where an editor will take a story and either buy the rights to it, or get all of the information and data from the investigative journalist, and then withhold the story from publication. So sometimes what happens is that journalists get really pissed off because all of their work mattered, so they'll hand it off to someone else, an independent journalist.
Right, exactly. And it's a lot of it has to do with, well, what's your motivation, right? If you're going to do the work and come up with a story, if your motivation is to simply make money off it, then it's not a big deal. But if you're a true journalist and you want the truth to come out, you don't know that somebody's going to kill the story when they buy it from you. And how demoralizing is that? Like, this story needs to be told, but your hands are tied and they've killed it.
Yep.
Right?
Yep, that's exactly right. So I think the takeaway, the happy news here is journalism is alive and well in this country. It's just somewhat hard to find sometimes, particularly if you don't know where to look. So there are a couple stories that I do want to cover that are hugely important that are not being covered by corporate media, and we'll get into that in just a second. So Andy, let's go into some more examples. This would be the next graphic, the Telecoms Act, because I think the background on this is really important. Okay, so at the start of this particular show, we talked about the Fairness Doctrine, and everyone's very familiar with that, particularly on the left. And it is my theory that the people on the left are more familiar with the Fairness Act because it was ended under Reagan, who was a Republican. Here's the piece you don't know: the Telecoms Act of 1996. And I've included a link here so that you can see it. This came about under Bill Clinton, the third way down, which is another way of saying Republican. What he actually did was allowed companies to consolidate. Prior to this act, you could only own so many newspaper outlets or so many television broadcast networks. When he put this into effect and he signed this and allowed it to go forward, we had this massive consolidation. So it was not just in the news space, but for telecoms like Comcast and all of these other broadcast companies. This is why you have so few cable companies available right now to you as a consumer. Well, it all translated down to your media networks as well. This is why we have such a serious consolidation in news. So remember that graphic we started with, where you had all of those outlets from left to right, and you, as a consumer, you're trying to make an educated guess about which kind of news is credible. Well, now we have just 5 companies, 5, that own all our newspapers, all our networks, all of our news broadcasts from a corporate standpoint. So thinking back to that graphic where you had all of those different news outlets owned by 5 companies, what are the chances that one single company owns a couple of them all across the spectrum? And they're simply brands. They're brands of the same company, and they make money off of ad revenue. So of course they're going to play the left against the right because it makes them money. That is what I need you to understand when it comes to where your news is coming from and why it feels like the country is so divided. It's not necessarily you and your community. It is the news networks who are propagating this, and they're ramping up all of this fear and everything that goes with it. And this is why I wanted to do another follow-up on Operation Mockingbird, because the impetus for changing a society and your opinion without you recognizing it is most effective through fear. As a parent, I remember, I couldn't let my son play really violent video games because I knew that there was something that happened in the brain chemistry that changed the brain chemistry. And this is part of what the news media is relying on. The more that you are tense and afraid, the more you are susceptible to certain suggestions. And then that becomes a permanent reflex. You're more likely to react violently in anger, shut down conversations, all of these sorts of things. This is literally happening right now in the United States. And most people aren't aware of where this comes from. So I just want to put this out there that here's where we were just a few short years ago, and here's where we are now. And just begs the question, do you remember when we as a society could have a conversation, disagree, come back, argue it a little bit, but we were still friendly and neighbors? It wasn't that long ago.
That's right. And I think that's a lot of what the mainstream media is relying on, right? And to your point, Carrie, about we see that corporations are involved in both sides of the spectrum. Well, a lot of that, we see that if you can control the narrative on both sides, and we understand that people like to live in an echo chamber. They like to hear opinions that are the same as their own. So if you see someone that just watches Fox News, that's all they watch, or just watches MSNBC, that's all they watch, right? So if you can feed the people on either side the narrative they want to hear, you can just keep them angry. And what happens is, if you're angry and your opinions are set for you, and you don't have the ability to have an open mind to consider other opinions, and you're angry about it, then you don't have the ability to talk to someone from the other side of the spectrum in a normal way about, oh, maybe the two of you are in huge medical debt, or maybe you both have huge amount of student debt, or you're having a hard time keeping food on the table, right? They want us to stay divided in that narrative, and that's why they do it.
Absolutely, because there's a profit to it. That conflict drives that kind of profit, and I've spoken to people who quite truly believe that if you are a liberal or on the left, that you don't believe in XYZ, all of these things, and they are steadfast in that belief. The same goes for people on the left, that if you are a conservative, that you must be racist and all of these other things. And neither of those are true for everyone. In fact, I have never met anyone who is solidly left or solidly right ever in my life.
Right. It's a spectrum.
Yeah.
In the same way, like when you're talking about stereotyping an entire group of people, right? Like the 75 million Americans that voted for Trump in 2020, you're going to throw them all in one category and understand why they voted for Trump, right? In the same way that people that have racist tendencies put all of either black or brown people in one category, right? Mm-hmm. There's no difference.
Exactly. And that is the state that we find ourselves, which is incredibly dangerous because, oh, by the way, we still have massive income inequality, far greater than we had during the Great Depression. We have evictions that have been happening all year long, even though the CDC, who has no authority, put out a request to not evict people. This has been happening. All of these things, and oh, by the way, massive pandemic where people are dying and suffering and still have medical debt. This is catastrophic for any society, and yet here we are. I am amazed that the United States has not, that we haven't seen far worse.
Well, and the other thing about America that most Americans don't know is that this is not the norm in the rest of the world, right? No. America is the extreme version of unfettered capitalism, where you're supposed to, look down or look badly upon what they call free handouts, right? Yeah. Like welfare and Social Security and all of these things, the bootstraps argument, that only really happens in the United States. But Americans are so involved in the narrative of the mainstream media pundits that they don't even hear. Like, one of the biggest arguments as a Canadian that I try to let people know is what you hear about the Canadian health system is usually completely wrong, right? You're not listening to Canadians. You're not listening to people that actually know. You're listening to the pundits that do not want the system to change. One of the biggest things that I've heard is, the wait times in Canada. The wait times are so huge. You could die waiting for an operation. Okay, sure. Thank you for telling me about my own healthcare system. I might have to wait 24 hours before I can go in and see my doctor because I had to make an appointment.
Great point. And then for my conservative viewers here, I want to give you this example. Religious holidays in the United States, in particular Christmas. Christmas now starts in October, according to the Consumer Index. I grew up overseas, and I got to tell you, as a Christian, Christmas looks entirely different in the rest of the world as it does here. You still have decorations and lights and everything, but it's mostly about community. It's mostly about giving back. And all of those people who are dirty and lazy here in this country, we call them our neighbors in the rest of the world, and we make sure, are you hungry? Do you need shelter? Do you need clothing? We make sure that everyone's taken care of. And there is not this massive consumerism. None of that happens. None of it. It's bells and music and food and candles, and that's pretty much it.
But I think that Christmas is an absolutely wonderful season because it allows people to participate, even if you aren't considered a religious person, right? Because we use the holiday at least as a time to put aside our differences and come together as a society, whether it's a religious holiday for you or not, and at least just a time that we can be thankful for what we have, and that we can spread some goodwill through our community, through feeding the homeless, or caroling, or any of those things, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why Christmas is such a wonderful time of year, despite your religious affiliations, right?
Yeah, and that's why that particular holiday was moved to December from a Christian standpoint, because they wanted all of the people, faith, no faith, whatever, to celebrate together, so that at least one time a year we could come together. So these are two really good examples of how our culture here in the United States has been railroaded by the narratives that we hear from corporate media. So I want to get into two others here. And I'm going to use one network to give you two sides of an example here. And we're going to focus on CNN. So on the right, and I know that Tucker put this out because of course he would. And people on the right have seen this. So Andy, this is the CNN fear cells. So Project Veritas, I'm sorry. This gentleman, okay, so yeah, I'm not crazy about how he gets his information, but this one stuck out at me. So they took this CNN director, Charlie Chester, and they basically catfished him. He thought he was on a date or whatever, and they videotaped him. And the reason why I think this is relevant is because recall when Flint was starting to ramp up and you had all of these journalists trying to get the story. There was, my apologies to her, Chelsea is her first name, I can't remember her last name. She's an independent journalist who did the same thing in Flint with a director of a quasi-government agency. She met him at a bar, had drinks with him, and recorded him admitting that in Flint, they were repossessing houses from people who had not paid their water bill while the water was poisoning them and making them sick, so that they could resell those houses to anyone and make money off it. He called it reducing the blight. And in the course of recording that, this guy made some seriously racist statements. So he all but admitted that Flint was a racist action, intentional, to get Black people out of what is a really nice area in Michigan, and to take away their homes, their wealth, and transfer it on to other people. So that happened in Flint. So here you see the same kind of tactic happening again with a director of CNN. So this is why I think it's valid. And recording laws in every state are a little bit different, but he was actually recorded making some when you go on a date, maybe you're trying to engage in a little bit of puffery, but there were some of the statements he made that I was like, no, I think he means that. And one of them that I wanted to call out was exactly what we're talking about here. So Charlie admits, he says, like, you can shape an entire people's perception about anything based on how you do it, right? just by forcing a story to help like your platform, you know? And he's right. That is manipulating a story. So think about every time we had an unarmed person shot, particularly a Black person, what happened is the media would jump to a public relations position. And we saw this in Wisconsin under the Kyle Rittenhouse thing and all these others, where the local papers became the PR arm for the police officer and published 2-page spreads about how wonderful the police officer was. And then here's the criminal record for, you know, the person that he murdered, right? Never once did they talk about police officers should not be executing citizens, guilty or not. That is not their job. They don't do that. Never once.
Not supposed to.
Well, no, they're not supposed to. We don't have a judge Dredd system here. We don't. And you're supposed to have due process. And
again, we're not supposed to.
Exactly. So rather than educating the public and bringing them back to a irrational position, what the media has done is sensationalized a lot of these protests and ignored certain things. And what I thought was just fascinating is they don't realize in this disconnect they were putting their own journalists at risk. And we see the results of it. So in Louisville, Kentucky, you saw the video of the journalists with their credentials on, standing away from protesters, being fired upon by police officers. All of that is illegal. It cannot happen, but yet it is. And we saw that in every one of these protests, every state, every city, where journalists were being targeted. And for those of you who are not familiar with this company, or with this concept, is journalists, particularly investigative journalists, our sole purpose is accountability. It has been that way from day one of the initiation of this nation. That is why it's been nicknamed the fourth branch. It is our job to hold politicians, elected officials, everyone accountable. It is our job to take this information and bring it out to you. Lies don't thrive in the sunlight. That's our job. So when you have this consolidation of all of these corporate media outlets who are playing upon fears and making money off it, while at the same time they are targeting their own journalists and independent journalists, you have a massive situation, not only for corruption, but for illegal action. And it's only a matter of time before it turned on their own journalists as well as the general public. And that's where we're at. It's just, it's amazing.
It's a hugely interesting dynamic, right? Where you had 4 years of Trump, you know, spouting fake news, anything that was that wasn't pro his administration, right? On the other side of the spectrum, you have progressives or left-leaning socialist people, you know, Bernie Sanders supporters, what have you, that also understand the narrative that mainstream media is fake news as well. So the majority of the population agree that it is fake news. There's a very small amount of people in society that are, you know, the centrist, left-leaning, you know, semi-wealthy white people, and Joanne Reed and Whoopi Goldberg, and they all are the only ones that are trying to say, oh, yes, that's absolutely correct. Yes, you know, the same apologists that are, you know, currently saying that Biden is the most progressive president in the history of the United States, right?
No, just since FDR. Just since FDR is what they're saying.
Well, so, okay. All right. Well, I'm sure that'll probably change too, but it's an interesting dynamic, right? Because if the left and the right knew that they were saying the same thing, right, but they never hear that narrative. because they can't make that connection because of how divided the population is. And everybody's angry and nobody's listening, right?
Yep, and that's the state where we find ourselves. And what I found was interesting about this particular story of the CNN guy and others in these corporate outlets is they will readily admit that the only place to get good, unbiased, credible journalism now is in the independent space, right? And we have always had independent journalists who are not bound by an editor or a paycheck to tell a good story, and that's where we are. So so getting back to CNN, I wanted to have a fair and balanced approach here. I condemn a corporate network. I do not necessarily condemn the journalists. So I wanted to get to the story that came out, and this is a journalist who inadvertently became the story, which you never want to have happen, but it happened. So Sarah, I think I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, Sidner, Sidner. She inadvertently became part of the story that she was covering. She was out in Minneapolis covering the Dante Wright murder, let's call it what it was. And she was covering the protests and the police response, right? It was a peaceful protest. You have a right to protest. And I know that there are certain states and legislators who are trying to make that illegal. Like right now, you cannot go and protest at the courthouse steps of your own Supreme Court. It is a felony now. And no one's challenging that this is a constitutionally protected right. How can the Supreme Court disallow that? Well, here we see the reflection of that in all of these different states and cities. You have a right to peaceably assemble, and then a local law enforcement agency, in this case in Minneapolis, decides that it's an unlawful gathering. Well, who said this is a lawful gathering? If the Constitution protects it, who are you to deny my constitutional rights? And these are questions that are not being addressed in corporate media. Thankfully, we're doing it. And I really want you to consider this when you see Seattle and Portland, Atlanta and Denver, all of these different places where the protests are going on. It is a lawful, peaceful assembly that is permitted under the United States Constitution, which trumps any state law. This is a fact. So this particular journalist was out there covering this when she herself was fired upon. And we see this time and time again now. And it doesn't seem to register with people that this is a crucial turning point in not only the office of journalism and what you're supposed to be doing, but us as a nation. And just my heart goes out to her because you could see, and she made the news because of the tweets that she was sending out in the live reports. And she said, in my 25 years, I have never heard police in America actually say journalists will be arrested during a protest. But that happened in Brooklyn Center last night. And I got to tell you, Sarah, I watched this over the last 2 years. I've seen it happen over and over again where journalists were being arrested. And fortunately, there is an organization who is also saying this. This is U.S. Press Freedom Tracker. So if you want to look this up online, I'll include a link. It's pressfreedomtracker.us. This is an organization that has also recognized the attack on journalism and free speech and all of the work that we are doing, and they are tracking the assaults. They are tracking the arrests. They are tracking broken cameras and equipment and all of these things. And I gotta tell you, as an independent journalist, I finance all of the software and tools and equipment. There is no corporation who's buying this stuff for me. And even if it is CNN buying cameras for someone, that's private property. And police departments, they have no right to apprehend it, take this information, erase your footage, destroy your cameras. All of that is highly illegal, and we are not having that conversation. Fortunately, you've got this one organization who has decided to start tracking it so that you can see it. And I would invite you to go out and take a look at their database, because it is truly amazing to me the number of incidents that have just grown exponentially over the last 5 years, and this year in particular. Already this year, you have 35 journalists who have been assaulted. And I don't mean like slapped or punched or whatever. I mean serious injury. All of these things as a result of how we treat journalists, the story, and, let's be honest, we don't want the stories getting out. We don't want people to know what's going on. We want you to be comfortable, and we want the brunch crowd in particular to go back to sleep. This is why it has become acceptable or unquestioned when police and law enforcement take a journalist off a story and do so through aggression, intimidation, all of this sort of thing. And, I feel strongly about this because in my career and doing the investigative journalism hasn't been that long, but in that short amount of time, when you cover corruption, brutality, law breaking, all this sort of thing, this is not new. This type of harassment is not new. I personally have celebrated my 6th death threat by writing about corruption and politics and things like that. And I kid you not, 6. And I don't have a big organization behind me. I didn't have a corporation defending me. And, based on where some of these threats came from, I did file FBI reports and things like that. But there is nobody who's going to serve a protection order at 3 a.m. when it comes to a journalist. So you're pretty much on your own. So I do have to, take a moment to thank the few people who did help me in some of these situations, in particular this last one, because that's all we got.
And we've seen this in real time as well, right? Especially some of our colleagues on the left in independent media with Craig and Fiorella and Convo Coach and someone that we worked with before, Tina Desiree Berg and Jordan Sheridan,
Glenn Greenwald, famous.
And Unicorn Riot that done some amazing coverage of these. Though we see them while they're streaming, standing way to the side of the main protests, having rubber bullets and projectiles fired directly at them.
Yeah.
Right. And a canister landing at their feet, and there's no one within 30 or 40 feet from them. This is a stifling and a completely illegal way to try to control the narrative and make them look bad. They're using the facial recognition software on their phones to record who's there in terms of media and build a database of people that they want to perhaps arrest in the future or make their lives miserable or whatever. And this is really scary. This is quite honestly, I know this narrative has been said over and over again, but it's extremely Orwellian. And that's what we have to be afraid of, is that that they're taking away our only voice.
The
only real true narrative, right?
And to your point, right, is it's not just the direct assault that some of our colleagues have faced, or waking up and there's a cop car parked out front and they follow you wherever you go. That sort of thing happens, and you kind of just, all right, it comes with the job. But then on the other side of it, we have where our streaming platforms are coming against us. And I mentioned it before, but I did a segment on another network talking about Joe Biden as a candidate and his donors. And I was pulling directly from the FEC reports from his campaign, and that got labeled a QAnon broadcast by YouTube. So it's happening all across the board. But there's one story in particular that I think really deserves its own segment, and corporate media is not covering this. And for love them or hate them, The jagoff comedian is the only one talking about it and elevating the story, and that should never be. And I love what he said in this broadcast, and I'm talking about Jimmy Dore. He said, look, if I can do better journalism in my garage high, then you have a problem at your network. And I can't argue with that, right? So
no.
Yeah. So
well, I don't think it's necessarily it's that, as he's saying, the ability, right? I think it's more the will to want to do it, right? I think that's the thing. I mean, how many we've told the story that last year we broke 6 stories that mainstream media eventually clicked onto and pulled our narrative for their own, right? Like, I mean, on our huge budget.
Yeah, our tens of dollars, which I'm happy in a certain respect that they would take our story and run with it, because they finally started talking about it. And yes. If that's our role to be the pacer for them, I'm fine with it. But this story that Jimmy elevated, this was Aaron Mattei who wrote this story, and this is epically huge. And I want to dedicate an entire segment to this. And I did reach out to Aaron to, I would rather talk to Aaron than talk about him. But this is the OPCW story about Syria and the Duma poisoning that was supposedly our reason for going in to get involved in Syria, and that has all been found to be a lie. And their own investigators and scientists, literal scientists who were in country collecting data said that it's all a lie. So, and what was interesting to me is on Jimmy's broadcast, they showed a clip of the UK investigation, and the woman from France, the representative from France, kept saying fake news, fake news, fake news, whenever the 2 Irish delegates were asking about this, right? So here it is, full circle. Trump used it on one side. Now we've got the left and a delegate from France who was complicit in all of this, using the fake news. No, at some point you got to believe the science, right? And you're a scientist. So this is another story that I want to call your attention to. I did put a link in the resources here, so I want you to go out and read it. And I hope that Aaron's got the time to come and join us and talk about this a little bit, because it deserves global attention for what is happening, not just because of the fraud that was perpetrated in the reasons for going to Syria, but if you understand what's happening right now in Syria, the number of women and children, families who are starving and dying because of the U.S., in particular, the U.S. intervention there, withholding medical supplies and food, wheat. We are starving people on purpose. And then you got to back up and say, why? Why are we doing this? So here's another bit of information about an independent journalist who has done phenomenal work that we're not reporting here in the United States. So we will do our best in our small little niche here to bring in these stories, as we always do, with a little bit of a deeper dive and background, so that we can encourage critical thinking. And of course, we always encourage pushback from our audience. If you disagree with something we say, if you've got another source, if you want to have an argument about it, totally open to it. But I got to tell you, we always cite our sources. We always vet. We do the best we can. And if I ever make a mistake, I'm more than happy to come on and do a full retraction, not a one line item, but a full retraction.
On page 37.
Right. As I admitted to with the Russia story, when it first came out, I was totally on board. And then, a couple of years ago, I was like, something's not right. So where's the P tape? I wanted to see it. So,
and not just because you're a deranged person.
No. Make it my ringtone or something. So yeah.
Well, I think that we have always said that as progressives, that we always want to take the high road in everything that we do, right? That we want to be above board. And I think that you and I are the same mindset, that if we continue to do our due diligence and do our job and report unbiasedly, eventually that comes out in the wash. Eventually we are known for our honesty and our unbiasedness. And I think that, eventually that all comes around.
Right. Hopefully. So send us some info in the comments. We have some really great guests coming up, particularly Wednesday and Friday. And we're going to promote all of that so you can hear these stories. I think these are, if it doesn't directly affect you, you will at least have some serious empathy, and it'll help provide some ideas for what these particular activists have done to reach out to not only media, but in their own community. So stay tuned for that. Did not have a chance to get to comments today. My apologies. We will definitely be back on Wednesday and make sure that we get your voices heard. So we really appreciate that. And then real quick shout out with our soft launch. Now that we've gotten independent and in syndication, wow, did we have a phenomenal week. As of Friday, we had 2,000 engagements on our live shows, but as of this morning, we're over 3,000. So, and that's zero advertising. That was all you sharing this and being supportive of the work that we do here. So thank you so much. Very, very much appreciated.
Now, I will say, though, Carrie, that I have been shouting out of my windows.
Oh, well, thank you, Andy. Thank you.
That's got to count for something.
Right.
At least the wildlife in my area is hearing about us. I don't know how much they're tuning in, but
they have no thumbs, so they don't count.
Yeah, we're not getting the thumbs up from the wildlife. So anyways, well, that was I thought that was an excellent show, Carrie. Thank you so much for all your due diligence and all your investigation. And I guess enjoy the rest of your Monday, everyone. We will see you back here on Wednesday morning, bright and early. Take care.
We bout that, ayy. We in the zone. We out here, yeah. Spitting the facts, how it's supposed to be. Hair of the dog, we keeping it